Hi, I'm Brian Johnson. I'm the director of Purdy was here at the Panama Festival, and I'm from Toronto, Canada. I've been a film critic most of my life and a journalist, I just bumped into it. Sometimes a story finds you. You don't go looking for a story. It's the story of a dead Canadian poet, and celebrated by a lot of living Canadian authors and musicians, such as some of them known internationally, like Leonard Cohen, I think people may have heard of, Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, people like that. I ran into it by accident. My wife, Marnie Jackson, who's a writer, was very interested in Al Purdy, who was one of our great poets, and she started writing a play about him. He was a very theatrical character. Even though I'd never made a documentary feature, I wasn't particularly intimidated by the form because I've sort of watched and studied and analyzed film for a long time. I've made short films, and documentary is really journalism by other means, and I've been a journalist all my life. I did find the biggest challenge was compression. It's not like writing a book where you have all the room in the world. You've only got so much time. And we were pretty ambitious in trying to do a lot of things at once. I wasn't intending to make a biographical film, but I wanted it to be contemporary and about, young and old artists inspired by this guy, this poet. But Al Purdy, my character, kind of started to take over the movie from the grave. And his story, which I thought I knew, started to offer some surprises as we found out that he had severely censored his own life story. So there was this biographical element, there was the contemporary element about the rebuilding of his cabin, there was an attempt to bring his poetry alive with music, the poetic element and the most cinematic element really of the film. So it was like a three-ring circus, and it was trying to balance all of these things without it making it look like just a bunch of stuff, to try to make it symphonic on some level. That was the trickiest thing. The editing. The shooting was all kinds of fun and, very enjoyable. And what I wasn't prepared for as a first-time, feature-length filmmaker was what happens when you hit post-production, that everything just kind of accelerates at an amazing speed as you hurtle towards this deadline. And instead of, like when you're writing a book, when you get to the stage of copy editing and proofs, the work kind of shrinks. Whereas in a film, once you think you're done, then the work expands exponentially, and I wasn't prepared for that. I will be looking around for a story. Unfortunately, I think the best stories are the ones that you don't look for. It's maybe a crass comparison, but in my younger years, it's like when you are kind of looking for a new girlfriend or something. It doesn't really help to look. It happens really when you're sort of taken unawares. But you have to be susceptible. You have to be open. You have to put yourselves in situations where stories will approach you. I'm going to the Cannes Film Festival probably for the last time as a film critic, putting my other hat back on. One of the reasons I want to do it is I want to immerse myself in all this world cinema and see where I want to take my life. Do I want to go back to writing, which is simpler, less complicated than producing and directing a documentary, where you get to spend 99% of your time doing the creative work and the research, as opposed to maybe half the time doing creative work and then half the time dealing with budgets and financing and all that kind of thing, which is no fun. But I'd love to make another film, yeah. To spend 2 years on a film, on a documentary, or longer, because documentaries have no end points, really. You stop making them when you run out of money or when you're trying to hit a festival deadline for your premiere. It has to be something that you really care about and that you want to. And at my age, 2 years of my life is like a larger fraction of what's left than it used to be. So yeah. A couple of things happened that I didn't expect. One was that Al Purdy's poetry kept giving us new discoveries. We kept finding answers to the film in the poetry. Everybody, the editor, the people who were shooting the film, my co-producer. The other thing is on the level of story. we discovered that Al Purdy had a second son by a second wife whom he'd never talked about. He'd never mentioned in his memoir that he got married a second time for a year, early in his own marriage, and then left that woman to go back to Urith Purdy, who was his wife for, many, many years, now his widow. We tracked down this guy, this who happens to be a poet, a failed poet, really, and that's kind of a third act reveal in the story. We hold that back to the end, and a lot of things start falling into place. And that was both a surprise and it was also a problem, because it was such a big. The interview with him was amazing, and he actually reads a poem about his father, which is heartbreaking. So the question was, well, what do you do with this? Because it's like dark matter all of a sudden, which is a good thing, because the danger of a film like this is you don't want it to be reverential. You don't want it to be a hagiography, a puff piece. You want it to be credible and real and three-dimensional. So to have this quantity of dark matter that we could dial up or down was very, very useful. But then there was a key critical question of just, where do you place that dial? Yeah, so that you aren't again losing the balance of the story. And the balance, of course, in making a film like this, which was so complex, was key. The balance is achieved in the editing and figuring out just how long to extend his interview. The problem is the interview was so good and was so powerful, and hits the audience so unexpectedly with such emotional power, that it had to kind of play out a bit. It couldn't just be a footnote. What it meant is that some of the people close to Al Purdy's widow, who did not want to talk about this guy, they resented the fact that we went into it in the depth that we did, because they were fearful for her response. They were being protective, and Al Purdy's widow is extremely protective about their private life and their marriage, which was a troubled one. But I felt, as a journalist and just as a documentary maker now, that you can't not tell part of the story just because you're worried about how people might respond. And in fact, the widow was much less. She was matter of fact about it. She loved the film, and I said, well, I understood you have trouble with this part about the son. And she said, well, you can't expect to like everything, A pretty good point of view, yeah. But what was great about finding that guy and interviewing him is that he wasn't an embittered son. He was more like an unrequited, he had an unrequited love for his father. So his admiration and kind of, total respect and love for his father, even though his father had kind of neglected him and abandoned him, that was tangible. So it didn't work against the mission of the film, which was really more about illuminating this guy's poetry and his importance and what all of that is about. Yeah. So you always have those priorities. It's the portrait of an artist, and it's the portrait of an artist's life. Well, how much art? How much life? How do they connect? And how do you make this thing sort of work as one thing? So my son composed the score, which was a battle royale. Not because it's hard working for a father to work with his son, but it's hard for a son to work with his father. Take orders from his dad. This is my second time at the Panama Festival. I was here a couple of years ago as a film critic, and I loved it then, and I love it now. I like smaller festivals. I do go to Cannes and to the Toronto Festival, but they're an awful lot of work. There's no kind of sense of everybody being together at the same party at the end of the night. And here, people, it's intimate here, but it's not so small that it's well organized. I've sort of studied festivals in the sense that I wrote the 25th anniversary book about the Toronto International Film Festival in the year 2000, which was unauthorized in the sense that they kind of commissioned it, but I controlled it. And you learn certain things. A festival has to be On the one hand, it has to have great programming. It also has to have sort of glamour, glitz, stars, which basically equal money. That's what sort of greases the wheels of the festival and the sponsorship and gets it to grow. And then finally, you have to have hospitality. You are in the hospitality business because filmmakers want to come here. They want to talk about it and say, look, you should go to Panama. It's great. Not just it's a great town, but it's a great festival. And this festival seems to understand the formula, that you have to have those three things happening all at once. And it's difficult. People here work really hard. I think it's interesting, the festival seems to be almost entirely run by women, and they are exceptionally skilled at what they do, and they are really conscientious, and they make you feel welcome, and they're very well organized. So, it's a pleasure to be here. What can I say? I love a good film festival. And there's something, it's funny, when a festival gets really successful, the irony is that then it stops being so much fun. A growing festival, you can kind of feel the energy. And also I feel the festival is somewhat in sync with the country, in the sense that Panama is a young country. It's growing. It's finding its national identity out of a colonial past. And a film festival really, like a movie. I see that a festival can be a bit like a movie. It's something where people look at themselves and they see their culture reflected, and it can move things forward.